Hey everybody, just to let you guys know, I put the timestamps for this video in the description box, so if you want to skip through any of the concepts that I talk about, you're more than welcome to go down there. I also included a link to the reference that I'm going to be using as well, so if you want to follow along in real time, go ahead and check that out. One last thing before I get this video started, I actually hosted a workshop earlier in the week discussing the same techniques that I'm using in this video, so if you stick around to the very end, I'm going to be discussing one of my students' pieces and how they approached it. This video has been my #1 requested tutorial since I started on Instagram, so I'm glad to finally get around to it. This is going to be a black and white reference. I think black and white might be an easy starting point for some people. I'm not going to be going into painting skin tones or anything like that. We're really just going to be discussing kind of the shapes of the face and how to achieve those shapes as well. I'm sure you guys have seen this method of drawing a circle for the head and then dividing it up into quarters, adding a bit of a jawline, all that stuff. But I want to get into sort of how we get to that point. And how to map out the face properly so that you're accurately capturing your reference or you're accurately drawing from real life. So I'm going to start by essentially drawing over this reference to show you guys how to map this out. I'm going to be doing a separate drawing. I don't like to draw over top of my references. I like to draw from scratch. So after we go through the face and its characteristics, I will be doing a drawing from scratch with this reference. So I'm going to get started. I'm going to draw a nice big circle starting at the top of my head, going down to the bottom of my nose. So about this size in here. So your nose is essentially always going to be at the bottom of this circle down here. And then, like I said, the top of your head is always going to be at the top of that circle in there. So I'm going to divide this circle in half vertically and then roughly in half horizontally as well. So to find this jaw length, what we have to do, so this length down here, if we look at the size of this half, we're gonna add this length below our circle as well, and then draw a dot kind of at the bottom there. So let me show you guys really quickly without these lines and without the reference below it. So basically, this half, I'm going to add another half and then draw a dot at the bottom of that half. And then if I put the reference back in, that should be right in there, our chin. I can't really express how to draw the jaw in proportion to anything else. You really have to look at the shapes that are in that jaw. So I'm going to really quickly sketch in my jawline over here. Everybody's jaw is different. That's why I can't say, oh, your jaw is roughly this big in proportion to this and this and this. So you really have to be looking back and forth at your reference or at the person in front of you if you're drawing from life. So first and foremost, I'm gonna make another layer over top of this, just so I can sketch some things out. So if we look at the proportions of the face underneath this, we can notice a few different things. So for one, your eyebrows are gonna essentially line up with that middle line. Now the reference that we're using, his face is kind of tilted to the side a little bit. You can tell because you can't really see this ear in behind over here. You can only see this one. So his head is kind of turned a little bit to the side. But essentially our eyebrows are going to fall along that middle line. And then next up, like I had mentioned before, our nose is going to be at the bottom of this circle in here. We've already mapped out our chin, so that's about another half length. And then let's do a couple of things. So I'm going to take these marks away for 2 seconds. If I were to divide this bottom section of this circle in half, and then the bottom of this section in half as well, we're going to find a couple of things. Oh, I should divide this section in half as well up here. Okay, so let's really quickly discuss what we're going to find when my reference is back. So up here, this is roughly going to be our hairline. So this is the upper section of our circle, and it's been divided in half once again. And that's going to be our hairline. This second line in here, that's going to be our eyebrows that we had noted already. And once again, that's going to be the middle of our circle. So right below that, right below our eyebrows, obviously our eyes. One thing I should really quickly mention that I see in a lot of new artists is people often tend to draw their eyebrows and their eyes really, really close together, kind of like that. But in reality, you often leave about an eye space between your eyebrows and your eyes. So a little space in between them. Everybody's proportions are going to be different, of course. These are just kind of some generalizations. So once again, at the bottom of that circle that we had noted before, that's roughly where your nose is going to fall. And then this section down here, where I've divided the bottom of the circle and the bottom of the jaw, this section down here is where our mouth is going to be. So I've got all of these facial features kind of mapped out. Let's bring back the reference underneath of this and see how accurate that is. Okay, pretty perfect. So let's go over these things once more really quickly. So I've got my circle in the middle here, this guy over here. Top of that circle is going to be the top of the head. Bottom of that circle down here is going to be the nose. If we split that circle in half, that's essentially where our eyebrows are going to be. And then if we split it in half vertically, you're going to have your nose in that middle section there. So if we divide the bottom of that circle up, we've got our eyes. And then if we divide the top half of it, we've got roughly our hairline. And then next, so what I did to find this chin line, I took, let's get rid of this for 2 seconds because it's getting a little bit messy. So I took this half of the circle, I added another half length, and then your chin is essentially going to be at the bottom of that, okay? So a couple more things to go over so that we can better proportion our face. So your ears at the side of your face are roughly going to be from your eyes to your nose. This section in here is going to be your little ear. Sometimes they're a little bit bigger, sometimes they're a little bit smaller. Once again, that's something that you have to kind of keep your eye out for. But if I were to draw this ear on the other side and I wanted to sketch a little bit of it in, I could use this proportion as reference. So roughly from the eye down to the nose. Another few things that we can do to find some proportions. So let's talk about the mouth really quickly. If my eyes, let me sketch in some eyes really quickly. If my eyes were pointing forward, I'm gonna make this dude look forward for a second. If my eyes are pointing forward and I draw a line from his pupil and then sketch that downward, you're essentially gonna find the corners of the mouth. So that's roughly how long your mouth is gonna be. What else can we do? Okay, another little point of reference that we can use is the corner of our nose and the corner of our eyebrow. So let's make some little points from the corner of our eyebrow to the corner of our nose. So drawing a line between these 2 points, we're roughly going to find the sides of our eye. So if I draw a line from the corner of my eyebrow to the corner of my nose, I'm going to find the edge of my eye, this little part in here. Now if we really quickly look at, I'm just going to minimize this. If we really quickly look at our eyebrows, they essentially line up with the corners of the nose as well. Now when I draw my characters, I don't necessarily do realistic characters. I kind of like to do a mix of cartoons or manga with realism, so I like to kind of merge a few different styles. I don't like to do full realism. So sometimes my eyes are going to be bigger, sometimes my nose might be smaller, my lips might be bigger, like all those features you can play around with eventually. But it is good to have this foundation to know where these things essentially lie on the face. Let me get rid of all of these guidelines. Okay, now that we've essentially mapped out the face and where those features are going to be on your face, it's time to draw this without sketching over top of it, okay? So I'm going to take my reference, I'm going to make it really tiny, just at the side of my canvas, so I can take you guys through this once more, okay? So I'm going to get started just like we started before. And if you remember how we started, we just went in with a nice big circle. I just want to choose a brush quickly. I'm going to go in with the 6B pencil just to sketch this out, okay? So just like we started before, I'm going to do a nice big circle right at the side. And remember how we laid this out? So I'm going to start by dividing this up into sections, so half vertically, half horizontally, and then we have to add a length to the bottom of this circle to find our chin. So this half in here, I'm gonna add to the bottom, and our chin should roughly be around there, okay? So next up, I'm going to sketch in the shape of my jaw. And like I said before, there's no real way to sort of map this out proportionally. So you really just have to look back and forth at your reference and at your drawing to accurately sketch in this jaw. So I'm gonna say the shape is kind of like this. This is just my base sketch, so I am gonna go over it nicely when I'm all finished as well and discuss how I would add in these values in the face. So I'm just gonna get rid of this little excess here. And same thing on the other side. I'm just really looking at my reference to sketch in this jaw shape, okay? And your first pass might not be the nicest. You might want to do a couple layers and refine it. But right now I'm just sketching, so we can be really loose and messy with this, okay? So just like I mentioned before, our eyebrows are roughly going to be on this middle line here. So I'm just going to sketch in really lightly some eyebrows. And what's next? So our nose is going to be at the bottom of this circle down here. Our eyes are going to be sort of in between our eyebrows and our nose, a little bit higher up though. And like I said, I'm just being really loose about these sketches. We will discuss in a moment how to draw these individual facial features as well. So I've got my eyebrows, my eyes, my nose. I'm gonna lightly sketch in a hairline, and like we mentioned before, it's roughly halfway between the top of the head and that center line there, so roughly halfway in there. I'm gonna make it a little bit higher up. Next up, we have to sketch in our mouth, so I'm gonna do so roughly halfway between our nose and our chin, so about in here. And just like I mentioned before, the corners of the mouth are going to line up with those eyes if they were pointing forward. So if I had my eyes looking forward rather than off to the side, you can draw a line and connect kind of the sides of the mouth in there. So I'm just adding little dots sort of to represent those corners of the mouth for now. I'm not focused on the actual individual shapes just yet. Honestly, if you were at this point to just add little circles for eyes and a triangle for the nose, that would be fine. We're just sketching. We will refine this on another layer. So next up, my ears. Like I said before, roughly in between the corner of my eye and the tip of the nose. So roughly in here. If you look at the reference, they're a little bit higher up. He's looking off to the side, and this part is tilted to an angle a little bit, so it's going to be a little bit higher up than exactly at that corner of the eye. and the corner of the nose. So just a little higher up. And then the other ear, we can't see as much. I'm just gonna lightly sketch it in at the side. Our neck, so we have to look at the proportions of our neck compared to the proportions of the head. If you notice on this side in here, there's just a little bit of a dip, and then we have that neck. And same on this side, there's not much space. This guy has quite a wide neck. I'm just gonna add little lines at the sides of his face, and then sketch in his shoulders as well. Now, when you sketch shoulders, you have to look at the angle that the shoulder is on. So this shoulder, you have to keep in mind and look back and forth at your reference how far this is pointing down, okay? So I'm gonna refine my sketch a little bit. I think his shoulders are a little bit lower than that. They're leaning down a little lower than that. Okay, so I'm just gonna sketch in my neckline as well. And last but not least for the sketch, we have to add a little bit of hair. So I'm looking at the height of the hair. His hair is obviously quite tall, so I'm gonna add quite a bit of height to this hair. Now let's sketch in proportion to something. I think it's roughly the size of his forehead. So in between his hairline, let me use some red for this. So in between his eyebrows and his hairline, this space in here, his hair is roughly the same height, okay? So I'm gonna be conscious of that when I'm sketching in his hair. So roughly this space in here is how tall his hair is. So about up to there. And I'm just gonna loosely sketch in. Like I said, this is just the sketch layer, so it's not gonna be done nicely just yet. Make sure you're focusing on this sideburn area as well. Very important, and a lot of people neglect it, so the head can have a weird shape without it. Make sure you're adding that in there. And now I've got my sketch layer. So obviously if you're drawing a face for the first time, you're not going to have these individual features drawn in or sketched in so nicely or so proportionate. So you really have to be focusing on your reference and the shapes within it, okay? So we're gonna talk about that a little bit more in depth. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna turn the opacity right down to about 20%, just in that range. And we're gonna start to draw over top of it, okay? So now that I've got these areas mapped out, we really have to be focusing on the shapes of all of our facial features compared to our drawing over here. I'm noticing right away that the corner of this eyebrow almost meets the side of the face in there, okay? So that means that I drew this way too far in. I've got to meet that almost at the side of the head. So I'm gonna loosely sketch in the side of his head, just like that. And then the corner of that eyebrow, like I said, almost touches the side of his head. So let me just sketch in that shape really quickly. Eyebrows tend to be thicker at the inner corner and taper off in the outer corner. So I tend to draw the shape kind of like this. So it's almost like a nice big rectangle shape, and then it trails off at the end. A lot of my students hate drawing from references because they think it doesn't let them be as creative. I don't draw from references a lot of the time these days, and that's because I've looked at so many references in the past. So because I've studied so many, now I can draw without them accurately. And a lot of my students run into the issue where they have this idea in their head and they don't know how to translate it to paper. But if you're avoiding references and if you're avoiding drawing from life, you're not going to be able to properly express your ideas unless you've looked at a lot of references and worked from a lot of references in your time. So don't avoid references. They're not bad. I don't think you should copy everything, but especially if you're just starting or if you're really looking to study, I really suggest, and I can only emphasize this so much, to look at references and to learn from them, okay? So I'm gonna really be looking at the shape of my eyebrow in here when I'm drawing it on this face. And what I like to do when I sketch eyebrows, I like to leave some kind of scraggly hairs as well. These guys in here are what I'm referring to, these kind of bushy little brow hairs that stick out. Anything that kind of adds a little bit of character can prevent your drawing from looking too stale, I suppose. So I'm just really focusing on the shape of my brow in there. I'm gonna go ahead and do my other brow as well. I just want to shape this one a little bit more off to the side there. And then this other brow, if we notice, it's a little bit lower. Now, if we look at the shape of this eyebrow and the space between the hairline, I don't have mine done so accurately just yet, so I'm just gonna use my eraser to kind of carve the shape a little bit better. And I'm really looking at the space between that eyebrow and the rest of his hair. So I've got these little eyebrows sketched in. I'm gonna move on to his eyes and I'm gonna make a new layer. I like to make new layers between features so I can just easily erase things if I need to. So something I noticed a lot of new artists do is they really forget about drawing this upper eyelid in here. It's very important. It's really what gives the shape to your eye. I'm gonna take this out for 2 seconds just so I can show you what I mean. I see a lot of artists just kind of making this sort of almond shape for their eye, kind of like that, right? And this is fine. If you do have monolids, you're not gonna see a lot of that upper eyelid either. But you really want to focus on not only the shape of the white areas of the eye, like this area in here, but also the shape surrounding that eye. So that upper eyelid, the space of the brow bone as well, very important, your lower eyelid as well. So I'm going to be really conscious of those things when I'm drawing in my eye. So I'm going to start by kind of sketching in his upper lash line. Now if we look at our reference, these lashes kind of go outward like that, whereas these lashes towards the middle kind of go a little bit more downwards. And then the lashes on the other eye, these upper lashes, they all kind of point a little bit more down. So like I said, the lashes on the eye on the left, the lashes at the corner of the eye, the outer corner, they kind of go outward, whereas the inner corner, they go a little bit more downward. So I'm just sketching in tiny little lashes. Less is more when it comes to eyelashes as well. I see some people sketching an eye and then they just do like a billion of these little lashes. You don't really need a lot. Even if you just have a couple here and there, you can really effectively express those little eyelashes in there. So next up, like I had mentioned, I want to really focus on that upper eyelid and the shape of it. So it's kind of this soft, rounded shape up in here. And then if we notice this inner corner of the eye, he's got this kind of pronounced area where his nose comes up, the bridge of his nose. So I'm gonna make sure I add that to my drawing as well, this area right in here. Next up, I'm sketching in the inner corner of my eye and my lower lash line as well. And then my eye, a lot of people will draw just circles for your iris and your pupil. Notice in the reference, because his eye is turned, you're only really seeing this oval shape rather than a circle shape. It's kind of a slivered eye. You're not seeing this whole rounded circle shape, okay? I'm just gonna get rid of these quickly. So back to my drawing, I wanna be conscious of that as well. And I'm not showing the whole circle as well. A lot of his eye is covered by his upper eyelid. And then I'm really lightly sketching in his lower lid, because if you sketch it in too much, it's just gonna turn out looking like bags under the eyes, and it's not really what I'm going for. So I'm just really gently sketching in some little lines to suggest a lower lid in there, okay? So moving on to the other eye, same idea as before. You really want to be looking back and forth at your reference and at the spaces between things as well, okay? And one thing I'm noticing as I'm drawing this, I've drawn my eyebrows quite thick in here, whereas in the reference, he's got some sparse areas in his eyebrows, kind of in these sections in here. Now it's all up to you whether you want to include those or not. I'm not really going to. I might go back towards the end and lighten up his brows a little bit in some sections. And I'm noticing as well that this brow has a more rounded appearance, whereas I've drawn this brow to be quite boxy and square. I do like to keep my eyebrows a little more boxy, but you might not want to. You might want to really stick to this reference. So I'm just going to go back in and erase mine a little bit, just to show you the shape that you might want to achieve. So I'm just taking off that squared off appearance of that eyebrow, just like that. And now onto that second eye. We're looking back and forth at our reference. Make sure you're saving a lot of room for this brow bone up in here as well. And like I'd mentioned before, those eyelashes on this eye are turning downward a little bit more, so I'm just gonna lightly sketch some in, going a little bit more down, and I'm not gonna overdo my lashes either. I'm gonna erase some of these little guys. And like I'd mentioned on the other eye, you're not gonna see a totally round circular iris in here. A lot of it is covered by the upper eyelid, and his eye isn't fully open in our reference either. Now I'm noticing his upper eyelid is a little bit higher up, so I'm just gonna sketch that in right now. I'm trying not to be too heavy-handed with this sketch either, so I'm just making nice sort of light lines, and keep erasing and going back over little areas until you find the right shape. If you are sketching with pencil and paper, it is very important to sketch lightly. You just want to kind of hover your hand over your paper and just very lightly sketch in these lines. Otherwise, if you sketch too dark, it's going to be really, really tricky to erase, and you're always going to have these lines in there. So I've got my two eyes added in here. I'm just going to sketch in some very tiny lower lashes, and I'm noticing this upper eyelid on his other eye. It's a little bit lower in the inner corner as well, so I'm just going to add that in there. Next up, I'm going to make another layer just as I had done before. I'm going to sketch in his nose. So like we had mentioned before, the nose is going to follow the bottom of that circle there. And we really have to be conscious of the shape of the nostrils, of the bridge of the nose, all of those good things in there. I don't really like to sketch the bridge of the nose in too much. I feel like if you really add dark lines in here, it kind of looks a little bit awkward. So I'm gonna keep these lines nice and light, and we're really just focusing on the tip of the nose for now, okay? So tip of the nose, those little outer corners in there, look at them in proportion to perhaps the eye. So I'm looking over here, I can draw a little triangle in here, in between that pupil and that corner of the nose, kind of like that. You wanna really focus on the shapes of that nostril as well. I'm gonna do the same on the other side. Just gently sketch in these shapes. Now, if we notice, he's got little piercings in there as well, so I'm gonna try to preserve those little details. I'm gonna really look at the shapes of his nostrils. They're quite wide, so they're almost these shapes in here. So let's go back onto my drawing and add those little shapes in there. This other nostril, I'm noticing this area has a much sharper edge compared to this one. And just very faintly put in his little piercing as well. It's a cute little detail. Okay, next up, making a new layer for another feature. Before I get down to his mouth and his jaw and all that good stuff, I want to touch up a few things. So first and foremost, this side of his face, I'm really looking at his cheekbone structure in here. So he has quite a rounded cheekbone up at the top there, and I want to make sure to add that so that I can fully capture his features. Moving down to his jaw shape, he does have quite a sharp jaw at the bottom as well. Now notice he's got kind of this highlight near his jaw as well. I'm not going to actually sketch that highlight in. I'm going to do that a little bit later on. So I'm not going to add a line like this. I'm just going to leave that blank for now, okay? Now I'm going to sketch in carefully his chin. And like I said, make sure you're drawing light enough so that you can go back and make any changes that you need to, okay? So if you need to change the shape of the chin, if you're noticing you haven't given enough room for the mouth, things like that, you always want to sketch nice and light so that you can go back and change these things. Obviously, I'm drawing digitally, so I can just erase anything and go back kind of as many times as I need. Next up, I'm going to sketch in that mouth. So to do so, I'm just going to start by drawing in the outer corners of his mouth. And to draw this mouth, I'm not going to draw such a harsh line for his lips. If we look at the reference, he doesn't actually have this harsh black line in here for his lips. I might do a little bit of line for his cupid's bow up there, but really I'm focusing on this middle shape, maybe a little bit of the lower lip as well, okay? So like I said, I'm focusing just a little bit on that cupid's bow in there, as well as this line for his mouth, okay? And then as a last little detail for his mouth, I'm keeping it very, very simple. I'm just gonna sketch in that faint line right at the bottom of his lips. You can kind of see there's a faint line between his lips and his chin. So I'm just adding that very, very lightly. We are going to shade this in as well, so I'm not focusing on drawing these harsh lines for his mouth, like I said. And maybe just a little bit of a line in there for his chin. What I'm noticing between my drawing and the reference is that the chin that I've made is a little bit too small, so I'm going to really quickly adjust some things. I have the liquify tool on Procreate, so that makes things pretty easy. I'm just going to shift the mouth a little bit more up, and that should be okay for now. I might go back and make some changes later. So now that I have a lot of these features in here, I'm going to merge these layers down, just because I'm pretty comfortable having them on one layer now, but I'm keeping it so that this layer is separate from that sketch underneath. Next up, I'm going to sketch in his ears. So once again, we're looking at the size of the ear compared to the rest of the head. So I want to really focus on the shapes of the ear. He's got this kind of U shape underneath here. He's got that piercing in there as well. So I'm going to make sure I add that. The way that I drew in the ear so far in this under sketch, it's kind of this shape. But if we remember from our reference, it's more of this U shape. So I'm going to make sure I try to achieve this shape rather than this shape that I've already sketched in here, okay? So I'm just gonna erase this quickly. And when I'm drawing this ear, I'm focusing on the size and shape of it, so I want to look at the shape surrounding it as well. If we notice up in here, there's kind of this L shape in between his ear and his hairline. So I want to make sure to transfer that shape over to my drawing once again, which I've already kind of done. And to sketch in the details of that ear, I really recommend looking at a lot of ears. I know that sounds kind of weird, but looking at the shapes of them, the shapes within the ear tend to be pretty consistent, but obviously the sizes, some shapes are going to differ as well. So really study that ear so you can get comfortable with those shapes inside. We've got this line coming downwards, kind of like this. But once you get comfortable drawing ears, you're going to kind of understand the shapes within them a little bit better. So you really just want to focus on all of these little kind of crevices in here. So I'm fairly comfortable with this ear. I feel like this bottom portion could be rounded a little bit more. So I'm going to go in and do that. And I'm always going back and forth with my pencil and with my eraser to achieve these shapes. If you are working digitally, sometimes it's a lot easier. If I wanted to, I could just go into Liquify and change the shape. But sometimes it's good to get to learn how to draw these shapes as well, how to draw them in and not always rely on the Liquify tool as well. It is very handy, but obviously, if you want to transfer your art and do, pen and ink or something like that, you will have to just learn to draw these shapes. You can't always rely on these tools, right? I'm going to sketch in the other ear, and we can see in the reference, there's not a whole lot of it shown. We can see just a little bit of this tip of the ear. And that's going to be the top of it, and it goes down roughly to the sides of his nose, that same height. So I'm just going to sketch in those tiny little details. It's a little bit smaller than I've made it, so I'm just going to make it a little more narrow. So really quickly, I just want to compare my reference to the shape of my face as well. If you want to take some artistic liberties, you will get more comfortable doing that once you draw more faces. So I like to draw these kind of boxed off eyebrows. Like I said, these very square eyebrows. His aren't as square in the reference, and I just want to go back and forth. I'm gonna try my best to emulate these shapes a little bit better. So I'm going in with my Liquify tool. You should go ahead and make any adjustments if you're drawing along as well. I just want to make this a softer curve rather than being such a harsh line. So I'm just adjusting this eyebrow a little bit. I might erase a little bit of the other eyebrow as well. And before I move on to the hair, I'm just going in, I'm making any changes that I think are necessary. For example, I think the lower lid of this eye comes up a little bit more, so I'm going to erase into his eye a little bit, kind of like that. And then on his other eye, I'm noticing that his iris touches both the top and the bottom of his upper and lower lids, so I'm going to make sure mine is doing that. It's a little bit messy, the one that I've drawn. I'm just going to refine it a little bit. I notice as well the inner corner of his eye, it really, in the reference, this is quite a curve in here, and the way that I have mine, it's really quite flat. I'm really going to quickly just adjust that inner corner of his eye so that that slope is a little bit higher, kind of like so that it's more of a slope rather than a straight line. I know these are very small details to recognize, but they are very important in the long run if you want to properly capture a reference or learn how to draw faces properly. So you really want to pay attention to all these tiny little details, the curves of the face, all of these small things in here, okay? So next up, I've made a new layer. I'm just going to go in now really quickly and sketch in his hairline. I'm going to be quite messy about the hair. I'm just going to sketch in some jagged lines. But this hairline isn't entirely flat. It kind of dips in a little bit over here. So I want to make sure I properly capture that, as well as we've got some hairs going in this direction in this side over here. So if I look at my reference, I want to make sure I'm capturing not only this little dip in here, but these little wispy hairs as well. So So I've got these little wispy hairs off to the side, and they're all kind of horizontal. Now I'm gonna look at the shapes of his hair. Like I said, I'm gonna sketch it in quite quickly. The side of his hair kind of curves out like this, and he's got these little curls coming off to the sides. I'm gonna really quickly fill in the mass of my hair. I wouldn't do this if I were working in color, but because it's black and white, I'm really just gonna lay on some black. If you really wanted to paint this accurately, notice in these little sections he's got some light reflected bouncing off of his curls as well. So if you want to get really, really technical, you can add those things, but I'm just going to keep things quite flat for mine, quite illustrative and kind of cartoony as well, a little bit. So even though I'm adding this massive hair and I don't have a lot of detail going in, I still want to make sure I'm capturing these little bouncy curls off to the side. You don't want to add a ton of like this. Those curls don't look like that. They're kind of pointing up and curling in different directions over here. And then I've got some off to the side that are kind of curling up. They don't quite connect over there. So even though I've got quite this black mass, I still want to add some little curls sticking out so you can really see the shape of the hair. Okay, a few more things before we get to the shading. I'm gonna really quickly sketch in my neck as well. So I'm just gonna merge the hair down with the rest of the face and gently sketch in my neck. Like we had mentioned before, it's not quite the width of the head, so it's a little bit smaller in here. It's not this width, it's a little bit smaller. So same on the other side, it's not quite the width of the head. I'm not gonna sketch in all of these details. Just like when we were doing the mouth, you don't see a lot of harsh lines in here. But I'm just gonna gently suggest with maybe 1 or 2 lines that he's got his Adam's apple in there, creases in his neck, just a little bit. And if you notice, the inner section of his neck kind of points down in this kind of triangle shape like that. So just like I did with the hair, I'm just gonna fill in this area with black. I'm not worried too much about details for the shirt. Very important, I forgot his little earring, so I'm gonna add that in right now. Just a tiny one with, once again, my 6B pencil. Alright guys, so before I go in and add some more layers to this, I wanna make sure everything kind of lines up neatly. I wanna change anything that I feel the need to change right now, so really quickly I'm just gonna make some adjustments. If you want to leave it here, you don't want to add a lot of detail, that's totally fine. However, I want to really capture kind of the values in his face as well, all of those shadows and the light. So I'm going to make a new layer. I'm going to change the opacity so it's probably around 30%. And because it's black and white, we're just obviously working with black and white. So I'm going to really quickly fill in his entire face. Maybe with a bigger brush just to really slap this tone in there. Hey there, this is Editor Seb. I just want to pop in and make a quick note. If you're working with a traditional medium like pencil and paper, I suggest skipping the next step and just working light to dark instead of dark to light. Now, if you're working in Procreate, I suggest making a clipping mask. So if you don't know what that is, essentially you're making a layer above it. You're tapping on the layer, you're selecting clipping mask. want to make that a little bit darker underneath. Okay, so to recap, I've got a bunch of gray painted underneath of my line art, and I've got a clipping mask above my gray, and then I've got my line art above it. Okay, so what a clipping mask is, if you're not familiar, you can essentially draw over top, but it's only going to stay within the layer below it. So I'm not going to have lines going outside. I can try my best to draw outside of it, but it's not going to work. So this is really excellent if you want to take a painting-like approach to your piece. I kind of want mine in between. I don't want it to be entirely painting-like, but I also don't want it to be entirely flat and cartoony either. So I'm going to do a little bit of an in-between. So going in with my clipping mask, I'm gonna go in with a very low opacity layer. I'm gonna go in with black. And right now, I'm just focusing on darkening different areas of his face. I always start my drawings, so I start them with that flat color, then I go in with the shadows, and then last but not least are highlights and then your details as well. So once again, flat layer, shadows, highlights, and then details. So any kind of refinements come at the end. You always start big and work your way smaller. So I'm gonna go in, like I said, with a low opacity, and I'm just looking at where he's got these shadows on his face. So I'm noticing above his eyebrow he's got a bit of a shadow, on the other side as well. And what I like to do, because I'm working digitally, is I like to go back and forth between my brush tool and my smudge tool. So the smudge brush that I have right now is on soft pastel. I really like this one. It gives a bit of grit to the page so it doesn't look entirely smooth. Like it looks a little more organic. You get these little lines in between. I don't know if you guys can really see that, but I really like working with the soft pastel as my blending brush. So I just go back and forth between laying in those shadows and blending them out. I notice he's got a shadow near the bridge of his nose as well. So I'm just really quickly working to add those shadows in there. I'm gonna kind of sketch in his lips as well. His lips are a little bit darker in tone than the rest of his face. If we notice, kind of this side jaw area is a little bit darker as well. It's kind of a gradient. Make sure when you're using that blending tool as well, some of my students, I notice, like if I'm blending this area, I'm doing vertical motions. You don't want to do a lot of horizontal motions, or you're just going to smudge it in with the rest of that face. So I'm kind of smudging in the direction of my brush stroke. So if I've added these brush strokes kind of vertically, I'm going to be kind of smudging vertically as well. And so now that I've got this kind of base shade layer, I'm gonna take it on and off so you guys can see the difference. I've really added quite a bit of detail just with this simple layer, but we're not done quite yet. I'm gonna go in, I'm gonna do exactly the same thing, this time with a slightly darker opacity. So I'm gonna make a new layer above this. I'm gonna merge that right down with the base layer. I'm gonna make a new layer. It's gonna be a clipping mask as well. I'm gonna turn down the opacity so it's about 30%. I might go a little bit darker, but we'll see. And then I'm noticing the inner line of his lips has a little bit of darkness in there as well. So just in between here, just that line of his lips, and then maybe a little bit upwards as well. And maybe a little bit in his chin. I'll get to his chin in a second. So same idea as before, I'm just gonna merge this layer down into my base layer. So now all of that skin tone is on one layer. And my favorite part is doing the highlights. So yet again, making a new layer, it's gonna be a clipping mask. I'm gonna take a nice light gray and I'm just going to add anywhere that I see light. I like to reserve my whites for perhaps like the tip of his nose with a very stark white, but for now I'm just going in with a light gray. I don't want to add too much contrast to this just yet. And now our lips look a little bit more full. I've just simply added that line above and a little bit of highlight on the lower lip as well. At this point, I might fill in his eye color as well. Careful not to go in too light with the eye color. Your eyes often tend to have colors within them as well, so they're not always a stark white. So I'm going in with kind of a gray tone for mine. And then if we notice in the eye, the inner corners are a little bit darker as well. So I'm gonna make sure I'm adding that in. I don't wanna keep them just a flat white. Okay, now that we're done those subtle highlights, I'm gonna go in with a more harsh white. So I'm gonna merge all of those layers down once again. You don't necessarily have to. I like to, but it's up to you. And now I'm gonna go in with a nice bright white. I'm gonna add perhaps to the tip of the nose, a little bit around that jaw, and a little bit on the mouth as well, and then maybe on his earring too. Okay, so we've got this face rendered fairly nicely. It is very smooth, so usually at this point of time, I like to go in, I like to add little bits of grit to the face. So if I'm working in Procreate, I go in maybe with a spray paint tool, maybe add some darker areas and kind of blend those out as well. And then I'm not liking the tone of his face too much. I think those whites are a little bit too bright compared to the rest of his face. So what I'm gonna do really quickly, I'm gonna merge that down. I'm just gonna go in and I'm just going to find a nice value in between. I'm gonna go in, I'm gonna add some more shadows to this face, and then I should be done. If you are a beginner, please, please, please use your references and make sure to cross-reference. So look back and forth at your drawing, at your reference, look at the sizes of things, look at the shapes of things. I can't really tell you how exactly to look at these shapes. All I can tell you is to look at the shapes in between things as well. So not only looking at those eyebrows, but looking at perhaps how high those eyebrows are up compared to the eyes, you know, how much space is in between those eyes and those eyebrows versus how much space is in between those eyebrows and that hairline. And I'm looking back at my drawing, I'm noticing a few things are off, like my hairline could be higher up, my eyes could be a little bit smaller or a little bit further apart, things like that. But overall, like, it's just up to your own judgment. The lips, for example, I've made very, very plump, whereas his lips in the reference, I'm gonna go in quickly and show you guys what I mean. So his lips are quite long and fairly short, whereas the lips that I've drawn are shorter and a little higher up. These little things you will just catch eventually. I don't expect you guys, especially if it's your first sketch, to get all of these things right away, but it's just a matter of time and it's just a matter of looking at your reference. I can only say that so many times, guys. Hopefully next week or perhaps the week after, depending on what my schedule is like, I'm going to be uploading a painting tutorial as well. So rather than focusing on the sketch and laying out the face, it'll be focusing more so on painting skin tones, painting hair, and how I really go about that. So I wanted to include my students' work in this video. I hosted a workshop just the other day and we were discussing the exact same techniques that we used in this video. So I'm really, really proud of this student. I think they're only about 15 or 16 years old. So this student was working with their sketch first, adding a base layer of skin tone, and then working dark to light. So adding all of those shadows first and then going above it and adding all of those highlights. We also used a nice big brush to get those freckles in there as well. I suggest if you are working digitally, utilize the brushes that you have. You've got so many of them, and rather than individually drawing in all of those freckles, you could just easily take a splatter brush and map them out really, really quickly. So onto my interpretation of the workshop that I did. I used the exact same techniques as the ones in this video to render this face. The only real difference between this face versus the one that I worked on for this video is that I actually went above the line art at the end to add some additional details. And you'll notice that I wanted to render the face a little bit more in depth, and sometimes having line art kind of gets in the way of that. So working above your line art is very important as well. Don't get stuck in just using line art. If you want to do a more painterly like approach, you want to avoid a lot of line art. But like I said, I don't really like doing full realism or full cartoony work. I kind of like to find a nice middle ground. So I personally still like to have a little bit of line art in my piece rather than just painting the whole thing. If you zoom in perhaps to the side of her cheek, you'll notice that there is still this harsh black line rather than in the reference. You don't really get that. It's just kind of this smooth grayish tone. And looking at those tones in there, that's going to make a world of difference if you really want to approach it realistically rather than in this kind of stylized method. So anyway, guys, thank you all so much for watching. I hope this helped you improve in some sort of way, whether it just be looking at somebody else's techniques or applying it to your own work. If you end up making anything from this tutorial or you follow along even with a different reference, please send me your work over to @burgerface on Instagram. That's BRGRface, the same username as my YouTube account. And my Reddit is @burger_face. So that's @BRGR_face. Thank you all so much for watching. Have a great day, guys. Bye.